Spinning your seam allowances makes your finished blocks look great and lay very smoothly. So here I have two 4-patch blocks that were constructed in the same way, except one has spinning seams and one does not. And really these both look pretty good, but when you flip them over, you will notice that on the block with the spinning seams, all of the seam allowance in the center of the block is equally distributed around that block. When the seam allowance was not spun, the entire seam allowance folds over, and that creates an area of bulk right here. When it's just 4 pieces of fabric, you may not notice it as much, but if all of these were half square triangles, for instance, you're going to get a lot more bulk of seam allowance into that center of the block. This way, when you spin your seams, it's equally distributed. It's really pretty easy. For a block such as the 4-patch, you are going to go ahead and assemble both rows of your squares in the same way you normally would. It's a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and each seam allowance is pressed opposite of each other. So in this instance, they're both pressed toward the pink fabric and away from the yellow-orange fabric. When you go to put them together, you stitch again the same way you normally would. And this seam allowance, you have both seam allowances going toward that pink, just like we saw in the individual components. To determine how your seam allowances are going to spin, you're going to take your finger and you're going to point in the direction that seam allowance falls. So it goes to the right on the top and to the left on the bottom. Now make a circle with your finger, and that's how you're going to spin the seam allowances. So this one goes to the left. This seam allowance is going to go up, which continues this one going to the right and this one going down. To release that center, if you're using a standard stitch length, which is about 2.5 on my machine, your stitches are probably going to open pretty easily right there at the intersection. If you happen to have backstitched or you're using a very small stitch length, you may need to take a seam ripper and take out 1 or 2 stitches right at the very beginning. To press this, you don't want to put tons of pressure outward, but you're going to gently open that seam, take your iron, and press that open. So you see how we have a very equal distribution of our seam allowances around the block. The most basic form of this is in use in a 4-patch block, but this can be used in any type of block. So here I have a 9-patch. Anytime you have the intersecting seams, you can do this. What you want to keep in mind is that your seam allowances need to always go out from a block or into that block. So in this case, this row, the blue blocks have the seam allowance going out, and in this row, the blue is going inward towards the yellow and outward toward the yellow in this row. So it would reverse. If we had another block here, the seam allowance would again point to the yellow. So in this case, each row, the seam allowances point to the yellow, and that allows you to have a circle going this way, while all my seam allowances are laying nice and flat, and they continue. Since I know that this seam allowance, for instance, goes to the left, it comes down to the right and up below it. And this seam allowance I know needs to go up, goes up to the left, down to the right. So as long as you alternate, it's going to work on every kind of standard block.